Thank you for everyone who's online and joining us. Thank you for all of you in the room. Our next panel today is all about real-world evidence opportunities to advance pediatric medical devices. We have a lot to talk about and our incredible panelists. So we're going to keep intros to a minimum. You can read all of their bios and have links to their LinkedIn. They're all on the CTIP website on ctipmedtech.org. So I'll quickly introduce our panelists. Today we have Corey Magley, the Vice President of Partnerships and Management at Nest. Thank you, Corey, for being here. Katie Muse, Vice President for Science at Aetion. Thank you for being here, Katie. Stacy Alul, Vice President for Quality and Regulatory at NeuroPace. And joining us virtually is Charlie Viviano, Chief Medical Officer for OSEA at CDRH and FDA. So with that, I'm going to change it up so we can see Charlie. Thank you, Charlie, for joining us. And we are going to get started. I'm going to come and hang out with you guys over here. And maybe a good place for us to start is let's define some basic terms. So Charlie, I'm going to start with you. Can you give us, both from an FDA generally and from an FDA perspective, what is real world data? What is real world evidence? And what's its role in the regulation?
Yeah, thanks. And sorry I couldn't be with you guys in the room, but thanks for the opportunity to be here. So we published our guidance on real world data, real world evidence several years ago. And in that guidance, we mentioned that from our perspective, real world data are those data collected, routinely collected during the delivery of care. And real world evidence is the evidence generated from those data. So, in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, we're very open and willing to reviewing real world data and real world evidence in support of regulatory objectives. From our perspective, we don't draw a hard line between, real world data and other data. To us, real world evidence is clinical evidence. It's more about, the source of the evidence and the data rather than any, true distinctions between real world data, real world evidence, and non-real world data or real world evidence. Evidence generated from a traditional clinical trial, for example. We ask that the real world evidence is essentially deemed fit for purpose, just like non-real world evidence. A lot of the same considerations are in place. So certainly open and willing to accepting real world evidence to support regulatory objectives. And a lot of the considerations, we don't draw a hard line between or separate out real world data, real world evidence from other types of clinical evidence. And the assessment of it being fit for purpose is very similar in many ways to what's done for traditional clinical evidence, for example.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate that. So I think you point to a nuance that I think it's important for folks who maybe are less familiar, is that, to the FDA, data and evidence have the same need to be, as you described it, fit for purpose, whether it came from a randomized clinical trial or data extraction from the electronic health record and claims data. At the end of the day, the data still needs to meet that scrutiny of, does this data reflect the population and the intended use and does it bring the right level of evidence to support a regulatory decision about that indication in that patient population?
Right. Couldn't agree more. And there's no difference in our evidentiary standards or what we require, regardless of the source of the evidence. So we make those same benefit risk determinations and reasonable assurances of safety and effectiveness.
Thank you so much, Charlie. So I want to turn, Stacy, I'd love to hear from you, from a company's perspective, right? Somebody who brings products to market. What's your perspective on the need for real world evidence and how does it support pediatric device innovation in particular?
I'll say 2 words: lots, tons, necessary. 3 words.
All good ones.
So I actually want to walk people through, because I think this is the right audience when it comes to, and it was probably, I think, Emma who mentioned it on a previous panel, the necessity for collaboration, because when you try to do this on your own, you will fail. And I'm not saying that NeuroPace has had a failure. We haven't. We're a successful commercial company, but we have failed to figure out how to combine two things, which is the passion for wanting to bring a pediatric indication to an adult indication that we have for a device that was fundamentally 20 years ago designed for a pediatric indication. We don't have to change our device to be able to have it implanted in patients that are pediatrics. And so I want to walk people through that, because I started at NeuroPace, left and came back, and I have a passion for that. But what I figured out in that 20-year journey was we had to take the passion out to get to the data, so that the data led the story that we needed to have. And so I want to walk people through that, because I think this is the audience to understand why that's important, because I don't want anybody else to have the failures. And then again, the word failure means something different to different people. So excuse me, I need glasses. So we actually started our original pivotal IDE for a neurostimulator for epilepsy in 2005. We enrolled 240 patients and we implanted 191 with the device. Numbers are going to matter, and I think Katie will speak to this better than I will later. Our indication is for 18 and above. So we have this weirdo thing with pediatrics from 18 to 21. But what happens if you're under 18? So just hold that thought. We did a double-blind, sham-controlled, class 1 evidence from a data perspective. It took us 3 years to enroll those 240 patients, and it took us 8 years to get to an approval in 2013. That was for an adult indication. While we were under that process, we were also collecting long-term data on those patients, and we continued to enroll new patients outside of that original pivotal IDE. So we were adding patients along the way and increasing basically our patient years. That speaks to health inequity, because in that open label period of time, we actually did start enrolling more 18 to 21-year-olds. In our original pivotal study, we had very few. But ultimately, by adding those open label patients, we ended up with 50 pediatric patients, 18 to 21. We went back to the agency in around the 2013 period of time after our approval and said, would this be good enough to get a pediatric indication? And there was a lot of back and forward with the agency. And in 2019, we decided to do a retrospective chart review with an additional 20 patients. And we tried to look at getting that retrospective chart review down to a patient population with an age of 12 years. And we were still not successful. And where we landed was, unfortunately, 2019, with an IDE with a pediatric indication for an investigational device exemption to go into a clinical study with a pediatric patient population to enroll 200. So I'll go back and remind you, in 2005, our original adult indication, we had 240 adults, and we were being asked for an IDE with 200 patients in 2019. Then this thing called COVID happened in 2020, and we have been struggling ever since to enroll patients, pediatric patients, in that study. And so, Juan, I think the comment that you made at the start and the curve that you showed about that valley of death is for companies to acknowledge when you're in the valley of death. And to think differently and go to the agency in a collaborative way and say, it's not working. We're not winning here. No one's winning. And particularly when you have the conversation that we're following the data and the data's demonstrating that we're not winning, what we're finding out is that now that we have a secondary pivotal study underway with a more generalized indication where our device is being successful in the adult population, that safety data is very demonstrative of what we believe we could use for a future pediatric indication. And so if we follow that data, even if it is off-label, is there a working solution that we can get to? And I think we've got to come back to that collaborative table to get there. And so the question now for us is, where's the data?
Thank you so much, Stacey. I think you said you said everything you said was really interesting. I want to pull out two specific things. One was you talked about this journey that it sounds like you were kind of going on it alone. I mean, yes, you had your interactions with the FDA,
Absolutely.
but it was NeuroPace.
Mhm.
The other piece that you talked about is no one's winning, and lest anyone think, who cares about for-profit companies winning? When you say no one is winning, one of the groups that's not winning is the children who need this technology,
Absolutely.
who do not have access to it. So I think it's important for us to sort of recognize that children are being harmed by there not being appropriate technologies available for them. Turning to that journey alone, and especially that time period they were talking about, I think that brings us to Nest. Corey, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the history of Nest and the role that Nest is now playing in that ecosystem, so that companies like NeuroPace and companies at any stage can really not go through that journey alone.
Thanks, Juan. So NEST was the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, was founded in 2017 as a public-private partnership, and we receive our funding through a U01 grant from FDA, and specifically to accomplish the mission of advancing the use of RWE in regulatory submissions. And so the U01 cooperative agreement that funded NEST actually comes from the medical device user fee amendment fees, or the MEDUFA fees, paid by medical device companies to FDA. So in that respect, many of you who work for medical device companies in the room are investors in Nest. And so I mentioned the mission of Nest, advancing that RWE and its use in regulatory submissions. One of the things we're doing at Nest is to develop processes and frameworks and to serve as a convener of sorts in between medical device companies as sponsors and FDA to make sure that we are addressing three main challenges. The first is, where can we go to find high quality, reliable data sources in the real world data space, to make sure that we have processes and mechanisms to advance their appropriate use in regulatory submissions, and that those submissions will withstand the regulatory framework of FDA. I think Charlie spoke well to the challenges on the FDA side. They often, in real world evidence submissions, receive widely varying I would say documentation about data sources, whether they are fit for purpose. And so we're helping address that so that FDA has a consistent experience working with medical device sponsors, and that sponsors have a consistent and reliable experience. Because as Stacey said, and as you pointed out, Juan, especially when it comes to pediatric label expansion, the revenue opportunities can be murky at best and hard to predict. And therefore, having spent 25 years of my career inside of med tech companies, it's very difficult to make investment decisions in the face of murky revenue predictions. And so medical device companies, I think, want to see uncertainty taken out of the system. And if we can reassure them that RWE is not a riskier path than a traditional clinical study, hopefully we can get broader use of RWE from the ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah, no, I think, and lest anyone, I should disclose no one pays me, certainly not enough.
Certainly not Nest.
But I do, for the last year and a half, I sit on the governance committee for Nest. And I can speak to just having been able to see this focus on, I think the first 5 to 6 years of Nest was a lot of laying the foundation, right? What is real world evidence? What are the approaches to standardizing some of these considerations around how do you document the data? How do you look at things like data quality, missingness? How do you think of real world evidence as needing essentially its own quality management systems? You know, to Charlie's earlier point that because the FDA isn't thinking that RWE is less rigorous, it just has different considerations. And as an industry and as researchers, you know, we think about the rigor of prospective randomized controlled trials, but we know that that's not how the real world works. And so we still have to demonstrate rigor. That rigor can be manifest in different ways. And so having that Nest spend those first 5, 6 years and sort of laying that groundwork, and now using this next phase of Nest as now let's go do it and push as many projects as possible and show that this is doable as a true partnership between industry, between the regulators, and then Nest creating both an ecosystem, but also the processes that help people navigate those.
Absolutely.
It's good stuff. We're doing good stuff, guys. Speaking of the data, Katie, tell us more, you know, the EHR is a black box. It's a black box for clinicians. It's a black box for researchers. It is absolutely a black box for industry, but it's not the only source of data. And I think one of the things that people, when they think about real world data and think about real world, it's like, well, where do I start? How do I get data that can support this? I'd love to hear both, you know, your experience and also about the work that Aetion does, and how do we think about sourcing the RWD that supports the RWE?
Yeah, thank you. And for those who are not familiar with Aetion, we are a real world evidence service provider, and we partner with many clients and one of the sponsors, but we have work closely with Nest on the label updates using real world evidence. And you know, to your question, I think that is the biggest challenge, is finding fit for purpose data and really kind of defining what fit for purpose data is in the real world space. And you know, I will say we are on a journey in that regard as well. And I think with some of the processes and experiences that we are having collaboratively through the last year or so, specifically, you know, what we are trying to instill is ensuring that you are designing your study to kind of mirror what kind of study you would design or how it would look as a target clinical trial if you were doing a clinical trial, and mirror your real world evidence study off of that, and then go find the data or the options of data that may meet we kind of create a minimal set of study variables, the must-haves and the nice-to-haves. Really, it comes down to that. So your primary endpoint is a must-have, and really digging into with the data provider themselves as a first step, and then getting your hands on the actual data to understand how well those study variables are captured. You know, as we think about any type of real world data source, whether it's an EHR database, claims, or registry study, they're going to have different nuances and different things to consider. But as we think about that compared to a prospective clinical trial or clinical study, you know, one example I can think of is really understanding how and when your primary endpoint is being assessed and collected in the real world, and having that conversation with the regulator around, okay, if my outcome in a clinical trial would be assessed, let's say every 2 weeks for a year, How is that actually being done in routine clinical care? And is that given that the actual population upon which you're going to infer from your study results is the real world? How do you kind of connect those two, and how do you have that conversation with the regulator to kind of come to a consensus if you are able to? Because there is no perfect database. We say that all of the time. But what you can do is have as deep of an understanding as possible about the potential databases before you go and execute a real world study and get the buy-in from all partners. And I think that's what, having this ecosystem with Nest really facilitates those conversations in a way that I don't think has been done before in this space.
Yeah, no, and it's important, that you point that out, right? That there is no such thing as a perfect database. There's no such thing as a perfect randomized controlled trial. And so it's about finding, well, how do we actually work with this in a meaningful way, like you said, so that when you're in that conversation with your OHT, with a regulatory body, that everybody feels good about the decisions that we're making. Because at the end of the day, the whole point is making safe and effective devices available for patients, right?
Yeah.
That's why we all showed up here today, I assume, besides the free food. Right, that's what matters. And how does this enable us?
And I think just to add on to that point, many companies will say we are mission driven. And I think that's absolutely true for all companies. That's why most people get up and go to work every day. And I think when you look at it through the lens, particularly of pediatric indications, it's even more challenging because of just those bigger hurdles. But one thing that I think has significantly changed, and when I talk about the NeuroPace journey, is that collaborative community that is definitely changing. And we should really give kudos to the FDA for that. I think particularly groups like Dr. Piraeus's group at the FDA and the work that OSEA is doing with the OHTs in particular. There is a program for those that are medical device companies in the audience. If you have not taken advantage of the experiential learning program where you can get the FDA out into your facility, we have had the agency come out, our OHT, and actually meet with our physicians and our both our hepatologists and our neurosurgeons. We've had them meet with our pediatric patients and their caregivers and families. And it speaks to a lot of what was discussed in the earlier panel sessions around that level of patient centricity, because the really, really difficult determination that the agency has to make is a safety and effectiveness determination based on benefit risk. And the one thing that is so difficult when you look at that in comparison to an adult indication is that very many parents and caregivers of pediatric patients and their families will tell the FDA directly that they will take a very different benefit risk as a result of the burden that they have. And I think another piece of the data that doesn't come out because we don't have it yet is the health outcomes, the health economic and outcomes opportunities that we're missing as a result of not having that data in the system or not being scraped as it can be. Because for us, a SUDEP for a sudden unexpected death in epilepsy is horrendous for a family. But what is actually more horrendous for a family is a child that is repeatedly going into the emergency room because of a fall or a fracture or broken teeth, or the list is endless. And so they just want normal. And so their benefit risk associated with burden is so much more different than an adult population. And if you don't have that level of centricity in those discussions and you're not bringing that discussion forward, we're not being as mission driven as we believe we are.
I really appreciate you saying that. And I think we heard that in panel one about how important it is to think about from the perspective of what does a family think of? What is that risk benefit? What is that burden on a family who is going to care for a child with this condition for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 decades? And that's a different calculation than say, this is a stent going in a 70-year-old. We need to think about those things, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a bringing products to market perspective.
I'd like to add one more point here, something that I've been perseverating on as we've listened to the speakers and panelists, and as I take a step back outside of the medical device space, but just real world evidence for regulatory decision making in general. You know, some of the factors, we've done some reviews of real world evidence use cases that have been put forward for regulatory decision making, and some of the patterns that we see is finding the right rationale for that RWE. One being a trial is unethical or infeasible. 2 is there's a very high unmet medical need. 3, you have a deep understanding of the efficaciousness of the device or therapy or vaccine. And, you know, 4, that you may have off-label use. So you can do an observational study, or you may have use in another country, another jurisdiction that you can utilize compared to standard of care in your country or region. And, you know, in speaking with Juan and others, I think I've come to really see how pediatric medical devices are just right for that, for those opportunities. And that's not true of, you know, many other clinical spaces.
No, I appreciate that, Katie. And I think you're right. I think industry and innovators will find no better partners than advocates for children, whether it's pediatricians, pediatric surgeons, pediatric health systems, parents. Like, we are here to be your partners because your success is our success, because our success is taking care of kids. That's why I appreciate you saying that. I want to take Stacy's kudos for the FDA and turn it over to Charlie. As you know, Charlie, in our last 2 minutes, I'm going to start with you and then ask the same question of all of our panelists, which is, as you think about, and you tell us from the FDA's perspective, as you think about real world evidence, the role of NEST, the role of these processes from an FDA's perspective, what are you most excited about when it comes to pediatric and pediatric medical devices and real world evidence?
Yeah, thanks, Juan. So I'll be brief because I think it's already been alluded to by Katie. I think for us, off-label use is a really rich area, to try to leverage. So, those areas where there's a fair amount of off-label use that's being captured as part of, the routine delivery of care and routinely collected in delivery of care, I think those are really great opportunities to leverage real-world data and generate real-world evidence to support a lot of different objectives. But certainly, as I said earlier, from the center's perspective, we're certainly open to considering the real-world evidence from that real-world data. So, those areas that, and Katie, you alluded to in pediatrics, certainly exists. Those areas where there's a good amount of off-label use to go in mind and to leverage. Really excited about that as a prospect.
Amazing. Thank you, Charlie. Same question, Corey.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that excites me most is I spent the last 25 years in med tech companies, often in commercial roles where off-label use is a very tenuous tightrope you walk. You want to support use, you want to educate physicians, and you're in a position where you can turn it over to your medical affairs teams to provide a few studies to coach people on the right way to do this. But that whole situation, I think, puts companies in an unfair position of trying to support. It puts patients and families in an unfair position of making risk benefit I guess, trade-offs without adequate information. And it puts everybody in the ecosystem just in a really a delicate situation. And what I'm most excited about is we're looking for opportunities how to change that. And we're taking the communication that today occurs in the form of Q subs very asynchronously between FDA and medical device companies, and we're putting them all at the table in weekly project meetings and working on it collaboratively together. So that's one of the things I find most exciting, is just changing the conversation to one of collaboration and partnership.
That's super exciting. Katie, if you want to tell us a little bit.
Yeah, I echo Corey's excitement around the collaboration between all of the parties and the ability to, and the opportunity to continue to educate one another on the potential use of real world evidence, as well as principled use of real world evidence, which are two different things. And I will also say, within the pediatric med device community, what excites me the most is the passion behind at those manufacturers and the patients, because I think that's what it takes when we talk about struggling with identifying a fit for purpose database. I think there's a lot of willingness to build and contribute together to make that a reality. And that is very unique to this ecosystem, if you will.
Stacey, closing thought.
Change the shape of the curve by letting data take you on that journey. But particularly for pediatrics, acknowledge that the journey does not start at 18 years of age. And particularly for chronic diseases, these diseases like epilepsy, deafness with cochlear implants, diabetes type 1 for insulin infusion pumps, cardiac particularly, these are chronic diseases that are diagnosed in children. There is rich data. Ask any parent who has got a paper-based log of the experiences that they have. There is data out there. We need to capture it and give it to Katie. We need to be able to take that to the agency, and that is what's going to help bringing that village of data in a collaborative way together.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, Charlie joining us virtually, and all of you joining us here.